I'd like to welcome you all to the CEH exam prep by Model 2. My name is Randy Kohler, and I'll be assisting you with this video lab guide. Overview, just to give you guys an idea of what's going on. The goal of this video course is to help prepare you to successfully take and pass the Certified Ethical Hacker exam. The idea here is to use the video course as a study guide alongside your current study materials that you may have, any kind of background that you may be able to bring into play, and of course, experience that goes along the way as well. Everything in this course will be accurate to what is needed to know to pass the exam. Please pay attention and take notes as you may get questions to many, if not all of the topics that are going to be covered here. So let's start off. You guys probably heard of the CIA, which stands for the Confidentiality, Integrity, and Availability. And basically what we have is when it comes to confidentiality, we have encryption that comes into play. And here, the whole purpose of confidentiality is to keep things private, such as customer data, employee information, and thus. And so we do this through the process of encryption, which we will have a special unit just on that, where we talk about the different encryption methods that we can use and what all is involved with that. Then we get into what's called integrity of our CIA. Now, the integrity is making sure only authorized users are able to make authorized changes, such as databases and so forth. Now, we provide integrity through the use of what's called a hash value, or hashes. And we will also talk about this in the section where we talk about password cracking and so forth, as well as in the encryption module. And we have availability, which this basically says that we keep the resources available by either backing up, having a continuity plan, and so forth. Now, we generally provide availability through the use of clustering or the use of load balancing and such. Of course, also providing redundancy through multiple power supplies, multiple ISP providers possibly, just multiples of everything. RAID comes into play, your redundant array of inexpensive or independent disks, depending on what book you've read, and so forth. So remember that the CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and how we can provide those. Now, when it comes down to a step to have an effective security program, we basically get into senior management, which generally will go in and accept responsibility. We have a security policy, which is developed. We have procedures, which are written and implemented. And an employee awareness program is developed. We also then have metrics, which are collected, and an improvement process is then implemented. So let's take a look at some of that in greater details. We need to know about policies. Now, you probably heard of policies. You probably have signed policies when you started with a company, and these would basically be something like your internet acceptable use policies, monitoring policies, password policies, incident response policies, and so forth. So a policy basically will give us an overview of what is expected, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and the consequences thereof. So that way, when the company fires you for some reason, you can't come back and say, well, I didn't know. Well, it said in the Internet Acceptable Use Policy that you would not check out adult websites or gambling websites and so forth, and yet you were. And the consequences of that could be up to release of your job, and thus you're out the door kind of thing. Okay, so policies come into play for that. Now, procedures, very simply put, are just step-by-step implementations. So if something happens, you pull up the procedure and you check, okay, step 1, who do I call? Who do I contact? What do I do? Step 2, step 3, and you literally just follow it step by step. That's what procedures are generally doing for. So know the difference between a policy and procedure. Now, why this all matters? Now, keep in mind here, when it comes down to it, right, senior management can be held legally liable for breaches in security, unavailability of the systems, and possibly even disclosure of data client, as in disclosure of client data, right? So they have the liability there. Regulatory requirements are also very, very big. You need to know things about regulatory requirements, especially to the PCI compliance. We have also other things like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. We have HIPAA. which is your Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and Sarbanes-Oxley Act that we are seeing more and more out there as well. Now, one thing I have noticed out there in the field is that a lot of companies are focusing mainly on, are we compliant? If they are compliant, they don't really want to know how many issues they have on their network and so forth. They just want to know, hey, if we're compliant, then that's cool. We can check that off our check mark and we're good to go. If we're not compliant, then fix what needs to be fixed so we are compliant, so then we don't have to worry about the rest and so forth, right? So more and more companies are going this way, sadly, but that's part of how it is out there. Now, we also have penalties that could come into the financial side, up to $290 million, so lots of money out there that could be charged as fines and so forth. And, of course, federal prison, which I hear is not for everybody. Some of the areas of concerns, right, is employee access to the internet and how they access it and what they access. Employees' access to their assigned workstation, because, again, we don't want necessarily users logging on to every single station there or have the ability to do so. Employee accessing the corporate network remotely, and employees' awareness of the organization's assets and how to protect them. Again, this is where your policies come into play and such as well. Okay, now to change things up a little bit, there are different control types we need to be aware of, right? We have the administrative controls. This is basically the management's responsibilities necessary to protect the assets, and we have what's called the soft controls. We also have technical controls. This would be your logical protection mechanisms. They're generally going to be built into the hardware or the software, right? Like your IDSs, your IPSs, your firewalls, and so forth. And then we have physical controls. Now, physical controls generally will control to protect the facility's perimeter and internal resources. And one major one that is very, very important is they generally are going to be in concrete. They're going to be a couple feet above the ground, and they're called bollards. And the bollards are basically help to protect the buildings or even entryways and so forth from cars, buses, and so forth. And nowadays they actually have them where they come up out of the ground and then they go back down depending on, if it's like a bus route or something only for buses. The bus comes, the bollard will actually go down into the ground, the bus goes across, and then immediately after it goes out, it comes back up. You can YouTube some of this as well, just see some of those things. They're really popular in the UK as well, and again, they're called bollards. Now, I've seen it as well where they use it for not just protecting a particular building and so forth, but also for rerouting traffic and making sure that people can't, just browse through one street to go to the next and so forth. And usually they're in the form of big flower pots, as in big concrete flower pots that take up the entire street width and such. So anyhow, do the departments responsible for these different types of security communicate and work well together in your company? Again, that's another big one too that a lot of companies are not doing, is they're not communicating with each other, which could lead into lots of different types of attacks, especially on the social engineering side. So here's some of the soft controls. Again, this kind of goes back to the policies, procedures, standard guidelines, and so forth. It goes into employee management, testing and drills, right? Making sure, hey, what happens if there is an incident? How are people going to react? Are they going to panic? Or are they going to do it because we're drilling, we're testing, and so forth, right? Risk management and analysis. You have to, of course, figure out what you're actually at risk of. Information classification needs to also be taken into account, and this basically kind of goes into, how sensitive is the information, and are we giving it classifications such as internal, private use only? Are we giving it secret, top secret classifications, and so forth, right? Are we giving it labels and so forth or whatnot? And of course, through the process of awareness training, and companies are starting to do more and more of, which is definitely great for getting the social engineering attacks. All right, we have the technical and logical controls. Again, these would be like your firewalls, your IDSs, your intrusion detection systems, encryption, protocols that are being used, authentication mechanisms that we're using if we're using Kerberos or something like that, auditing and how we're doing the auditing, and also access control technologies. Now, we'll get into all these in a lot more detail here in the up and coming modules, but just so you know, it's all part of the technical logical controls. And of course, the physical controls, right? Your doors, windows, walls, and so forth. How are they put together? Am I able to go through the door because the door was unlocked, or because it had a simple lock on it that we were able to, bypass fairly easily? Security guards and dogs might also be part of that physical control. Fencing and lighting, as in how tall your fence is and what is your fence actually protecting, right? So we're putting barbed wire up there and so forth, right? And of course, lighting is also very important. Locks, right? Again, we're talking different types of locks too, and there's lots of ways we can go about bypassing some of that, and I'll be demonstrating some of that here in the up-and-coming modules as well. Environmental controls, again, this also, like your HVAC stuff, making sure that the server room doesn't have too much humidity and so forth, and things like that. And of course, your intrusion detection systems as well. And these could be cameras, things of that nature as well. Of course, I just mentioned the bollards, which are going to be coming out of the ground in the UK, or they'll be basically your concrete posts that will be in front of a building, so that way there's no car can easily drive into the building because they're protected by bollards. Okay, so now when we look at the evolving threat, there's definitely some things here we need to know. Now keep in mind, as we continue on with the modules, I'm not going to be referencing what you need to know, because everything we're talking about in this course you need to know. So how you remember it, again, making notes, and hopefully with some of the scenarios from your prior experience and any kind of studying you've done so far, all this will work really well together, and it'll start making a whole lot of sense, hopefully. All right, so anyways, when we're talking about the evolving threat, there's different types of folks out there. Now we have, of course, the script kiddie and so forth we start out with, which basically does it for curiosity, personal fame, and so forth. The next up is going to be the thieves. These are going to be your hobbyist hackers and so forth. They generally would do it for personal gain a lot of times, maybe for the money and so forth. However, when it comes down to it, the spies are going to have the largest segment by dollars spent on defense, and they might have national interest in mind and so forth, right? So we have lots of different types of threats out there. Now, other terminologies that we may come across. We also have what's called the hacktivist. Now, the hacktivists, these are going to be kind of more specialists and so forth. And basically, the hacktivist would be doing something for a cause. Now, the hacktivist is someone that maybe has a passion for saving the trees. So what they will do is maybe hack into a company that is cutting down trees, and to prevent them from cutting down trees or something like that. That would be considered a hacktivist, and they would generally do it for some agenda. Now, we also have another one called the suicide hacker. Now, the suicide hacker, very simply, is, just as it sounds, it's someone who doesn't care about getting caught and going to jail for a very long time. So rather that jail time be 5 years, 30 years, or whatever the case, they don't care. They just want to get it done, and they don't care what the results are. And they're called suicide hackers. Now, other terms here that kind of go along with this is what we call the white hat hacker. And the white hat hacker is basically someone works on the defensive side and helping to protect your systems and environments and so forth. So in essence, it's a hacker that does the defensive side. And they're also called penetration testers or security analysts. Now, on the other spectrum is the black hat hacker. And the black hat hacker is someone who does it for offensive purposes. And they don't really care about the rules of the trade and so forth. And we'll have another slide on this as well, where we differentiate between the black and white hat. Then we have the gray hat hacker, who mainly uses the defensive side, but on occasion will also get onto the offensive side. All right, now when we look at the security vulnerability life cycle, basically what happens is you have a vendor that ships the product out. The users of the product generally will find some kind of flaw, some kind of error, some kind of, something that's not working, and hey, lo and behold, it's a vulnerability that they've discovered. Now what happens is then the vendors get a hold of this, and they make modifications to those components. And then with that, they come up with a patch. Patch is basically released. Then the patch would be deployed at the customer site. Now, Microsoft kind of does this through the use of the automatic updates. Other vendors tend to do also with automatic updates and so forth, and checking every day and to see if there's a new update available and so on. But back in the day, they used to have it where the only way to get it to the customer was either via email, which was actually the secondary thing. First way to do it is to put it up on a site and then email the customer and say, hey, we have an update available. Make sure you download it and install it. It fixes some security vulnerability, right? And back in the day, people weren't doing it. So what ended up happening was attacks were occurring between the time the patch was released and before the patch was deployed at the customer site. And again, the time frame initially was actually pretty large. We had literally over a year initially, but what was happening was the black hat hackers and such, they were checking out the websites that had the patches released, and they would download the patch and reverse engineer it, and then come up with a exploit tool that would then exploit the vulnerability that's supposed to be patched, and thus they were able to do some of that. Now, exploit time line here, as I mentioned here, almost a year. For Nimda, 331 days between the patch where the patch was already out and by the time it was exploited. It took 331 days for Nimda to be created. SQL Slammer, 180 days, right there, 6 months. The Welchia-Nachi, 151 days. Blaster, 25 days. Now it's to the point where we have 2 hours or less for a patch to be reverse engineered, and as this cycle keeps getting shorter, patching is a less effective defense in large organizations, and mainly to the fact that a lot of organizations have customized applications that are running on the inside through their intranet and whatnot, and whenever they have an update for IE or for Java or whatnot, it causes the application to not function properly or not to be accessed properly. So a lot of organizations are stuck, yes, stuck at older versions of IE and older versions of Java and older versions of whatever else that they're using to connect to these applications. And these need to be, of course, tested and tried, have little beta groups and whatnot, a little group of people within the organization that will test it to verify all is well. And if so, then put that particular patch on the whitelist and then disperse it out to the rest of the organization. If it causes issues, then the alternative there would be to have one, of course, to keep it at the older version or to update the application. However, when you update the application, it causes a lot of development time, right, from the developers and so forth. And that could cost the organization lots of money. So they may justify, hey, it's going to cost us $1 million to update this app to the next version of Java. However, if we keep it the same, we actually get to keep that million. So the logic would be, yeah, we just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. And if we don't have to put a patch on it, we just won't. And that's generally what happens a lot of times out there. All right, so what happens is we basically get vulnerability assessments and penetration tests that are getting done. And what basically this allows us to do is intelligently manage our vulnerabilities. So any vulnerabilities that are found during vulnerability assessment, right, we can do a penetration test to see if we're actually vulnerable to attacks through those vulnerabilities by exploiting those. Right? It also avoids the cost of network downtime. And a lot of times, you're able to meet regulatory requirements and avoid fines, like you're PCI compliant if you're using some type of credit card, online transactions, and so forth. It also preserves the corporate image and customer loyalty. Very important, right? You don't want to lose your customers. It also justifies the security investments and satisfies prerequisites for cybersecurity insurance. Definitely a good way to go. A lot of companies, they're required to at least once a year do have a pen test being done. And I believe there's something just recently that's been passed that it requires companies to do it on an ongoing basis, not just once a year anymore. So definitely something to look into. There's different types of penetration testing. Black box testing assumes no prior knowledge of the infrastructure to be tested. So the testers must first determine the location and the extent of the systems before commencing their analysis. Right? The black box testing is also useful in cases where the tester assumes the role of an outside hacker, then tries to intrude into a system without adequate knowledge of the system. At the other end of the spectrum here is white box testing. So white box testing provides the tester with complete knowledge of the infrastructure to be tested, often including network diagrams, source code, and IP addressing information. This also will assume the role of an inside threat, also known as the insider, also known as the disgruntled employee. Right? Very important. There's also several variations between, which are often known as gray box testing. Now, again, the black box testing would be a black hat hacker type thing, right? So we only have one piece of information a lot of times, which is either a name, a phone number, URL, a domain name for the target, and so forth. In the white box, we generally will have even username and passwords for domain admins, things like that. All right. Other things to remember is hacking methodology. There's 5 phases, and the phases need to be known in order. We have what's called reconnaissance. This is basically where we go in and we intelligently work off obtaining information either passively or actively. And passively we mean by sniffing traffic, by eavesdropping, by looking over someone's shoulder. Right? Actively, where here I'm mentioning Aaron and Whois databases, which we'll talk about later when we talk about DNS and such, examining website HTML code and social engineering. And anyway, we'll have a whole module on reconnaissance and information gathering, footprinting, also known as, and it's definitely an interesting and one of my favorite topics. Then we get into scanning, second phase. This is identifying systems that are running on and the services active on them. We can do ping sweeps and port scans and so forth. There are definitely going to be port numbers we need to know about, and we'll hit those a few times throughout the course here. So make sure you have your port numbers down and what services there are running on those. The important thing about knowing port numbers is that when you look at a port scan using Nmap, your network mapper, you can identify if it's a Windows machine, if it's a Linux machine, if it's a printer, and things like that, all because of what ports are open on those machines or on those devices. So it's going to be very important that you know your port numbers. I would hate to have you go through the exam and get to a port number such as, let's say, what's the port number for Kerberos, and it is actually port 88, and it's used to authenticate users for username and password when they log on to a domain environment. And I hate to have you miss a question similar to that, all because you didn't know that Kerberos runs on port 88, HTTP runs on port 80, SMTP runs on port 25, and those could be easy questions that you can answer if you happen to just know those port numbers. And again, there will be roughly 24 or so port numbers you need to remember and memorize. All right, now scanning side there too, again, second phase, and we're going to be talking a lot about Nmap and the different switches and so forth. So my recommendation here is you get yourself more familiarized with Nmap. I'll be showing you a lot of these things too that we're talking about. So I'll be showing you different Nmap scans so you can see it. And if you have the ability, try it out on your own as well. See what different switches do what and what the output looks like and things like that. All right. Also, the third phase is called the gaining access phase, also known as the enumeration phase. This is where we exploit identifiable vulnerabilities to gain unauthorized access. We a lot of times can do this through exploiting a buffer overflow or brute forcing a password and logging onto the system. And again, this is also one we're going to have a chapter on all by itself, and it's going to be called the enumeration chapter. And mainly here we're talking about null sessions and how to construct a null sessions and how that all works, and what kind of things we can enumerate from that. Enumeration basically means is that we gain access through to a remote machine through means of like a null session type scenario. And again, we'll take a look into that and see what that looks like. All right, maintaining access is the fourth. There's uploading malicious software to ensure reentry is possible. Here we do this by installing Trojan horses that implement a backdoor on the system, for instance. So we'll talk about Trojan horses, rootkits, things of that nature. And then we also mention things like steganography and things like that too. To be able to also kind of help cover our tracks when it comes down to that. So that's the fifth hacking phase, so steganography, fifth hack. You can carry out activities to hide one's malicious activities. We could do this by deleting or modifying data in system and application logs, and we'll talk about this again in the hacking Windows module, where we will talk about password cracking techniques and so forth. We'll mention rainbow tables and things like that. We'll also talk about hiding files, such as with ADS, your alternate data streams and so forth. I'll show you guys what that looks like. Steganography would be another, and things like that. So rootkits has its own little section there as well, but all that is coming into play when it comes down to that. So know the 5 phases in order: reconnaissance, scanning, gaining access, also known as enumeration, maintaining access, and covering our tracks. So methodology for pen testing, basically we start off with footprinting. Right, we want to gather as much information, publicly available information as possible, and we can basically get this through ARIN, INNA, various websites and tools and so forth, and whatnot. Again, we'll have a whole section just on that. Again, the scanning portion, enumeration, we just talked about this, right? And then here we get into what's called the penetration side. Now, if the penetration fails, what generally will happen is we do a denial of service. And a lot of times this will happen in if it's in the malicious intent. So if the penetration fails for the malicious hacker, for instance, they'll do a denial of service attack possibly. And they basically say, hey, all else fails, and it's basically used as the last resort. So you did a good job on a security system, and generally an unskilled hacker will stop there. But a lot of times the denial service will then take the approach of, hey, if I can't have it, nobody can have it, kind of thing, right? Now, in a real pen test, however, unless authorized to do so, you will not be doing a denial service attack if the penetration fails. All right, just to keep that in mind there. If the penetration is successful, right, then we can go in and possibly do things like elevation of privileges, the manipulation of data, right, covering our tracks and things like that. Right, so anyway, good stuff. All right, and of course, leave backdoors. And again, these could be your rootkits using tools like Netcat, which we'll be talking about as well, and having to know some things about on that. All right, and then some of the penetration testing methodologies that you need to know about. One is called the OSTEM, also known as the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual. It can be found at the isacon.org/research/ostem.html site, and it will definitely assist you in how to do a pen test properly. It takes you through the step-by-steps and so forth. I would highly recommend that you check it out and at least glance over it at a bare minimum, and kind of get a feel of what the OSTEM is and so forth. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. This is going to be coming off of the SP 800-115, which is the Guide on Information Security Testing, which can be found at the csrc.nist.gov/publications/pubsps.html. Again, also highly recommend you at least take a peek at that. Then we have the FFIEC, which is your Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, Information Technology Examination. And it has an IT handbook that you can check out at the ithandbook.ffiec.gov/IT-booklets/information-security.aspx and look for the information security booklet. Again, check it out. There are a couple hundred pages there, so unless you really like reading and you want to cover it out, you can. But for exam purposes, just browse through and kind of get a general idea of what it is and what it's able to do there. All right. The Information System Security Assessment Framework, ISSAF. This is by the Open Information System Security Group. You can check that out at the OISSG.org website. All right, so let's take a real quick peek at the hacker versus a penetration tester. Now, the hacker here too would be considered the black hat hacker, and the penetration tester here would be the white hat hacker, also known as the security analyst, right? So when it comes down to it, there's no code or ethics, motivated by greed, cause, or fame, depending on what type of hacker it is, right? We talked about the different types, and the important ones we needed to remember here are going to be the one like the script kiddies, the suicide hackers, right? And of course, then your black hat hackers and such. So depending on what their cause is to do that. Now, the penetration tester here obviously will follow a strict code of ethics. The hacker will gain illegal entry as an unauthorized entry, where the penetration tester has to have legal entry, must have authorization, in writing even, right? Will try any technique without regards to loss. And again, they don't care if the server goes down and they lose data. However, the pen tester is defined to a set of boundaries, which is defined before the pen test even starts. Black Hat tries to bypass logging. Penetration tester needs to log and record all the activities. No report share or possibly shares exploits unless they're zero-day exploits. And these zero-day exploits are going to be exploits where there's no patch available. And a lot of times they will not share those. However, they may have the inkling of sharing those exploits after all. Who knows? But a lot of times they will share those zero-day exploits to themselves. The pen tester here presents a detailed report of the test. The hacker will exploit vulnerabilities where the pen tester will try to correct those vulnerabilities. Of course, the hacker is the black hat bad guy, and the good guy, white hat, is going to be the penetration tester / security analyst. All right, so to kind of wrap us up on this intro is to look into things like not just the tools, right? You need to be able to do other things, be creative. And I usually refer to this as thinking outside the box, right? So you want to think outside the box. You want to be dynamic and also have a good, thorough understanding of the technology and tools that you are using out there. Because keep in mind, tools will only get you so far out there, and it's all great to say, hey, I got this tool that does everything for me. However, it is a good idea to be able to do some things manually to verify, because the tools, as I've seen in the field, they don't necessarily do 100% of a good job all the time. Example would be something like Saint, and it's a Linux-only tool for vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and I've actually used it in the field where we got really good results on the vulnerability assessment side, but then when we used the penetration testing side of Saint, it came back with not so good results. And once we went in and manually verified, we were able to get in a whole lot more machines than what it found through the penetration testing on the tool side. So I'd highly recommend that yes, you can use tools, but I highly recommend that you actually go out there and test it out. Try it manually through different ways, methods, to see if you can actually penetrate some of the vulnerabilities, exploit those vulnerabilities type of thing. So, all right, now what we're going to be doing here next is we're going to get into some of the information gathering side, the reconnaissance footprinting side of things, and I'll be showing you guys some demos and show you guys how things are supposed to be looking and where we go and so forth. Again, keep in mind, everything in this course is designed to keep you on track specifically for the CEH exam. So make sure that you keep a hold of every little piece of information I give you because it may be pertinent to your passing with a good score at the end. So keep in mind, you may not want to just use the video for your studies. Keep in mind, I'll be referencing different things, websites, and again, encouraging you all to go out there, try things out as we go through this as well, and hopefully you have the ability to do so. And again, that will just reinforce what we're talking about here. It's a great way to do it. And again, I've just to let you guys know, I've been doing the CEH for a very long time, and I've focused on usually bigger classes, 20 to 25 students, and out of those I usually have a 98% pass rate, meaning that only 1 or 2 students may not pass as they go through my classes on these. That's mainly due to the fact that they didn't study at home and so forth. So it is required for you to take some study time after watching the videos, maybe doing a little research and verifying some of the information for your own sake, and just kind of reinforcing it. Because again, the likelihood of you remembering something just by hearing it is only 10%, right? So what we're trying to do here is get your senses involved. The more senses, the more you're going to remember. So not only will you hear things, you're going to see things, and then hopefully you'll have the opportunity to do things as well. And here we're getting in, different senses that will help reinforce and help you also remember the information that's being covered. All right, there's a lot of good stuff, and as we continue on, I'll throw some sample questions out there, but keep in mind, everything I'm talking about, you should be able to answer any questions regarding these topics, and again, we'll give you some samples of that as we continue on. So let's go ahead and hop into the next section. Thank you very much, and we'll see you here in a moment.